Hi there. Greetings. I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome to reading Carl Schmitt's Dictatorship. Today, we're in the second part of book chapter 6, which deals with, the dictatorship of contemporary law and order, the state of siege. We look today at pages 154 to 161. I'm not in my usual place because, as those of you who followed the live stream on Friday knows, that I've been sick. In fact, my wife's really sick. She's there, and I'm stuck in the apartment because it's COVID. I didn't, so I'm just trying to get this done, and I promise I'd try to get something done so that you have something Monday and Tuesday. We continue what we left off. We're finishing chapter 6 up, and thus ending this week. Hope to end dictatorship in that sense. We left off at that line about the question of question of historical contingency, right? He says that these positions are to be considered from two legal standpoints: that of universal scope, which helps with the help of which the development to follow will rise above what is historical contingent. So therefore, this he wants to get above this. So he's only got two legal standpoints in this point and both of these standpoints of legal universal scope. So let's continue. Again, this is pages 154 to 161 of the Polity edition, English translation of Dictatorship, as it is frequently mentioned in the draft on the constitutions and in the constitutions themselves. In the first part of the French Revolution, until the overthrow of the Jacobin Dominion, the intention was that the army should act effectively, but not draft constitutions in a legal sense, or be entitled to deliberate. So therefore, this idea that the army is basically to act effectively, but not draft constitutions. The army, or not, or entitled to deliberate. The army isn't. Okay. In other words, the military commander should always be just an instrument controlled by a civil institution, by a civil institution. He is only an instrument and not a commissar, just as the leader of the detachment sent to execute a verdict is a commissar. Okay, so in other words, the military aspect is not a commissar, is an instrument. The military officer, the military commander, is this merely an instrument, not a commissar. Just as the leader of a detachment sent to execute a verdict, right? That person, a leader, someone is a commissar. This attitude could not be upheld in an external. This attitude could not be upheld in an external war, because there, by definition, the military activity exceeds just a military state of emergency. The Ernstfall, there's this emergency state of a military state of emergency. In other words, it's this is the idea that a civil crisis or a civil structure, internal thing, that the military, a state of siege or a state of emergency, right? The Ernstfall, in German, is this state. Well, war is beyond that. Okay, in that sense. By contrast, in a military encounter with one's own citizens, this perspective was enforced all the more vigorously. In other words, that therefore, ideally, that in other words, this here repeating that this attitude generally, he says, right, it should be the case. But in contrast to military occasions, this encounter with one's own civilians, a military encounter with one's own citizens, right? This perspective was enforced even more rigorously, he says, vigorously, under no circumstances, as it is declared by Emmanuel Joseph Sayas in Article 13 of the draft of the Declaration of Human and Civil Rights, should the army be employed against citizens within the country. Again, this is a classic, the army should not be employed against the citizens in the army of the country, right? This is the argument of the Article 13. Politically, this sentence belongs to the entire system of the revolution, which was designed to weaken the royal executive, right? It was designed to make the army no longer, in other words, the army was the instrument of the royal executive. And therefore, the revolutionaries wanted to undermine that authority in that sense. When the military commander is not a commissar, it follows that he is not a commissarial dictator either, but only the instrument of a dictatorship, supposing any such happens. In other words, the military isn't the dictator. The military commander isn't the dictator. He's not even a commissar in that sense, and he's not. It follows that he's not a military commissar dictator either in that sense. Remember the distinction earlier in the other chapters between a commissarial dictator is someone who is having authority under an authority under a sovereign. A sovereign has authorized them to do something. So he's not even the traditional dictator in the classic Roman sense, right? The idea of the Roman dictator was a commissarial dictator in that sense. He had a commission, and it was ordered by the law to do this, or the institution that he was not bound by the law, but he was created by his function and office was created by it, and it's done to service the body politic in that sense. So he's neither what he says. He's neither a commissar in a normal situation. He's neither the commissar, a military dictator, and he's not a commissar dictator either, but only an instrument of a dictatorship, supposing any such happens. It was thought initially that one could. Let me just shrink this. Sorry, I'm not using my normal computer. I'm using an office computer, the work computer that I have at home in the laptop, because I don't really like doing videos on. But it was thought initially that one could manage with a single requisitioning of military support from the civil administration. Right, the people were convinced that they only had to deal with the riotings, not with a civil war. So the original idea is that you had to deal with a riot, not a civil war, in other words. That therefore, in the situation is that the civil administration would give an instruction to the military authorities to do this, to settle a riot, okay? Not with a civil war. Modeling on the English example of the Riot Act, the French law dating from 21st October 1789, against gatherings or martial law, was declared when in Paris uproars over the shortages of supplies broke out in the National Convention, which had moved from Versailles to Paris only just prior to that, recognized the need to protect the freedoms of its deliberations from the tumult. Okay, this is a reference. Let me go to look at the reference. This is to show you guys what it is. Yeah, this is to the collections of the documents, so I'm not going to really go into. It's not a substantive reference. The law conferred local authorities the right and responsibility to demand that the army forces, the forces militaires, be immediately raised when public peace, tranquillité, was threatened, in order to reestablish public order. Okay. The local community was accountable for all the consequences of any neglect in this matter. Martial law was declared by the hosting a red flag from the main window of the town hall. At the same time, the local community called upon the chiefs of the National Guard, the self-defense militia, the police, or the regular troops to supply armed support. So therefore, if there was a martial law declared, in that sense, the red flag would be put up, and therefore the local authority, the local community local community called upon the chiefs of the National Guard, that is the chief of the self-defense militia, the police, and the regular troops to supply armed support. At the given signal by the red flag, all disorderly congregations, whether armed or not, became illegal and had to be dispersed by armed force. The requested armed forces, the National Guard, police, or regular troops, had to be made to march straight away under the order of their officers and accompanied at least by one local clerk. A red flag also had to be borne in front of the troops. A local clerk, but not the officer, had to ask the assembled crowd the reasons for their gathering. So not the officer, local clerk, local civil bureaucrat, what the reason for the gathering. The crowd was then allowed to nominate 6 men to represent its complaints and petitions. The others had to withdraw. Immediately and peacefully. Failing this, they were strongly urged by the local clerk to return peacefully by the local clerks to retire peacefully to their homes. The injunction ran thus. I could read the French. You can see the translations over here. It says, everyone is advised that martial law has been declared, that all gatherings are criminal offenses. We are going to shoot. All citizens must withdraw. Okay, that's what he would say. The injunction would say that. They're saying this is the injunction that the clerk would announce to the citizens that are assembled and legally assembled at that time, in that sense. If the crowd withdrew peacefully, then only the ringleaders were prosecuted and punished in an extraordinary procedure. In other words, there was an extraordinary legal proceeding to deal with that. If before or during this injunction the crowd used violence, or if it did not retreat peacefully after the third exhortation, then armed forces were deployed. The legal meaning of this function of the army, which is set in motion once the above ordered formal prescription of the law is satisfied, is very clearly defined by the law of 1789, namely in the sense that this law becomes in effect identical with what is understood by law martiale, the forces des armées, l'instant, or the use of force will be instantaneous, right? This prevention. The force of weapons will be immediate in that sense. Use of arms, right? The French is arms, okay? That is when violent acts are committed, or after the third ineffective exhortation. Again, the French doing that is, I'll just read the translation, used against the rebels without anybody being responsible for the offense that might ensue. So again, what he said, 2 things happen. There's either violence acts have been done, or that after the third thing, after the third ineffective exhortation, what has happened, that violence will be used. He says that violence will be used against the rebels without anyone being responsible for the offense that, in other words, no accountability. That if there'll be no legal accountability for what happens now. The soldiers shooting people, the soldiers, military, and the commander, what is done to stop the legal group was no longer bound by law in that sense. As for the rioting crowd that commits violence act, it was said of its participating members that they would be punished insofar as, again the French, managed to avoid the blows of the armed force. In other words, they'd be punished insofar as that they survive. In other words, if they survive the blows or the actions of the armed force. The whole idea of this regulation is that all the initiatives and directions rest with the local authorities, elected as they are by the citizens, and that the military commander is only an obedient executive. So through the decrees of the now next paragraph, through the decrees of the Constituent National Assembly of 3 February 1790. Again, that's the edition, that's a reference note. The local authorities were urged to declare martial law if public security was imperiled in any way, and to support each other in recruitment of army troops. So therefore, after this decree, the National Assembly said local authorities were urged to declare martial law if public security was imperiled in any way, right? Any way, very minimal, and that they each should support each other in recruitment of troops, right? Again, through the decree of 2nd June 1790, the municipalities were mandated with the maintenance of public security and order, and all the decent people, in other words, the public security and order, and all the decent people, the honest gens, the honest gens, honest gens, the decent people, were asked to contribute to rendering the distribution of public order innocuous. In other words, making it as painlessly as possible. Just please, all decent people, just don't make trouble. Just make the distribution of it comply to make public order possible. Such people hold on. Such people were to be declared, the people who did this, such people would be declared enemies of the Constitution, of the National Assembly, and of the nation and of the king, if they had to, in other words, those who didn't comply. Well, let's see if that's right. I mean, I want to get this translation. I'm looking at this. The decent people were asked to render the disturbed. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that they were asked to contribute to rendering them innocuous. That means useless, stopping them at all costs. The disturbers of public order, that's who he's talking about. Such people, the disturbers of public order, were to be declared enemies of the Constitution, the National Assembly, and of the nation and the king. They had to be arrested and penalized according to the law. And all had to be done without detriment to the implementation of martial law. So therefore, in other words, without in other words, harm to the national law in that sense, the martial law in that sense. In other words, the execution of the execution. This is why it's translated. The prejudicing the execution of the that's French. Sans prejudice, without prejudicing the execution of the martial law. Translation problem. The National Guard, the police, and the army had to comply with the demands of the administrative organs in order to maintain public peace and preserve the respect for law. In addition, there existed already special courts that had been granted jurisdiction over riot and similar crimes by way of the commissarial mandate. Again, this is a reference note. Let's look at this for the purpose of this. I'm going to have to read it because it's a substantive. The proposal to form a tribute recruited from within the National Convention in order to judge such cases, which was discussed in October 1789, together with the martial law, was rejected because of constitutional concerns arising from the doctrine of the separation of powers. Okay, so therefore, originally that was Robespierre considered these concerns irrelevant. See, this is noticed in the parliamentary archives. On the other hand, by the decree of 21st October 1787, the staff of the Collège de Paris was given the authority to decide all charges of les nations without appeal until a special tribunal was established. Therefore, the previous order gave the Collège de Paris the authority to anything that charges of what is that? How you translate less, Sean? The nation, charges of the nation, without appeal. In other words, immediate jurisdiction. Um, with until a council is established. So therefore, and initially, this commission was entitled to it was entitled also not entailed. Sorry, entailed. It means entailed means it means that they executed the thing that they had to do, right? That also entailed the trial of authors of inflammatory pamphlets, right? Again, through decree of 31st July 1790. And see also the delegations of the trial of certain derelicts to the authority of the Tribunal of Orleans for a final verdict and decision decree of 5th March 1791. Through the decree of 2nd July 1790, mentioned earlier, a number of presidential courts were mandated to act as courts of first and last resort. So, in other words, the decree of 2nd July 1790, presidential courts were created, and these were courts of first and last resort, and were obliged to present the findings of the investigation and all evidence to the National Assembly. So therefore, the court was the first and last instance, special presidential courts that were done, and that they were given the authority to deal with this, and they had to report and give their evidence to the National Assembly. So that's the substantive note at 20. So sorry, like this. I hate to go back and forth, but I understand. Section 19. Sorry, this is. In fact, in other words, they granted. In other words, this National Guard maintain peace. Hold on, I just want to make sure I'm not reading it wrong. The medicines make me kind of. Okay, let's look at here too. I said the National Guard, police, and the army. Okay. Why am I looking at something wrong? I'm just looking at this. Okay, such people were doing that. I'll read this paragraph. I'll read that paragraph here again, just to kind of make a point. The National Guard, the police, and the army had to compel with the demands of administrative organs in order to maintain public peace and preserve the respect for law. In addition, there already existed special courts that had been granted jurisdiction over riots and similar crimes by way of commissarial mandates. Right. This is 19. Let's look at that. And that's what I read. So I apologize. Right. That's right. I think I. In fact, the National Assembly itself appealed to the king to give the necessary orders to his commissars or troop commanders, has already been mentioned in a different context, right? Again, 20, this is see page 123, 132, he says, in such cases, the commissar of the department was given the authority to command the police in a certain city and to monitor the execution of the laws, right? Decree of 8th June 1790 concerning the riots of Stetzel. In the cities where they met with resistance or where the authorities were violently interfered with in the exercise of their official duties, royal commissars were explicitly authorized to request armed forces and to imitate criminal prosecutions of the rebellion's leaders. Decree of 8th July. Right. So when the riot increased, the statutes of martial law supplemented this condition, and when and where repeated disruption of public peace is imminent, martial law continues to be declared and remains in force for indefinite periods of time. During this time, until martial law was explicitly suspended, all gatherings were prohibited. caffeine. The law of 26 July 1791 against forming crowds, whose oversight was a function of civilian authorities, was enacted at the same time as this enactment. This law imposed the mobilization of armed forces to suppress such crowds, and it compelled every citizen to contribute to the suppression under certain conditions. Right? And again, this is a specific reference note, so I will have to read it. He goes. This cites the two sources, and he says every citizen must obey in assisting and aiding any depositary who represents public authority when he was resisted and claimed. The force of law, force of the law, force et la law, laws. When everything was then everyone was obliged to respond and offer help, according to the decree of 28th February 1791. Here again, following the English example, the Riot Act. Okay. Local communities were held accountable for damages resulting from the turmoil. So therefore, local communities were damages. The damages were done, the local authorities. But most importantly, right now, the inescapable consequence of emergency law, not direct, emergency law, comes into effect. The person who exercised it had thereby the powers to decide whether the conditions required to declare it existed or not. So therefore, in other words, once the law set this possibility up, the question is the official, in other words, a person who exercised this ability, this local community, had the right to decide the condition whether it existed or not, that he could exercise it. There were urgent cases in which armed force was now permitted to intervene even without a formal request, especially to fight robbery and looting. Okay, so if there's looting, you don't even have to get if a unit, someone in the military commander sees looting and robbery, they have to act without an expected request, right? Without a formal request. When the riots had taken over the whole province, the king placed the order needed to reestablish orders under the responsibilities of his minister, and accompanied them by an obligation to inform the legislative assembly about his measures straight away and to convene it on the spot, if it was not already assembled. In other words, the legislature had to be assembled to this. In other words, they had to convene it if it wasn't or to convene it on the spot if it wasn't assembled, right? So therefore, to report his things, or if they weren't assembled, then he needed to convene them. These regulations of the law, Article 3031, were incorporated into the French Constitution of 1791, Title 4, Article 2. This law also repeats the characteristic formula that when the armed forces actually proceed against the rebels, according to the requirement of this law, which is an injunction to disperse, its members are to bear no responsibility for the consequences that might follow from this action, Article 27. The state of siege is not mentioned in the law of 26 February 1791, although this matter, the stat de siege, state of siege, had been regulated in a compendious manner before, in the law of 8 July 1791. But that, of course, was a completely different context from battling against rebels and restoring public safety. The law of 8 July 1791 dealt mainly with technical military issues, namely the maintenance and classifications of military positions and posts. places of war and military, the places of war and military outposts, right? The postes militaires. And this was problematic. This fact that this law was really aimed at technical issues, not was divided. This problematic was divided into three categories: policing of fortifications, terms and conditions of the employment of officers and the company of troops, construction of fortifications, compensation for the private property that was necessary, confiscated result, and such like. The state of siege was mentioned here in connection with the fact that in a fortified place, the relation between the army and the civilian authorities are also under control, among other things. There was a fortification, a fortified place, that the relations between the army and the civilians are also controlled under this. The law meticulously lists the fortified places imposed where it was valid: 109 fortified places and 59 military posts. There were no mentions of the possibility of other areas or districts where martial law or the state of siege could be declared, nor was there any mention of the attack on the domestic enemy, either by critics or by rebels. Okay, so no, the existing law that is here. This is dealing with fortifications and posts that dealt with the interconnection between the military and the civilian authorities, given the way these things intermingled in such military outposts or fortifications, right? And that they were specified. So, in fact, he specified in the existing law, the earlier law, he says, and therefore it doesn't. It's not written to deal with a general state of siege, right? And the problem outside of these fortifications, right? There's no mention of the possibilities of other areas or districts where martial law or state of siege could be declared, nor was there any mention of an attack on the domestic enemy, either critics or by rebels. Three kinds of estates, three kind of states, three kinds of states are distinguished in which any of the fortified places specified could be found: Estats de paix, states of peace; Estats de guerre, states of war; and the Estats de siege, state of siege. So the three states: the state of peace, state of war, and state of siege. And therefore, in times of peace, military officials had supreme authority only over the army and over undisputed military affairs. For the rest, policing was for everyone else. Policing was exclusively a matter for the civilian bodies. In time of war, civilian bodies retained their policing function, but the commander was entitled to request measures concerned with order and public. Pardon. The commander was entitled to request measures concerned with order and the police, insofar as these measures were hand in hand with military security in the area. So therefore, that insofar as these things that were hand in hand with military security, the military commander had this. Hence, he had to lay before the civilian authorities the decision of the war council at the fortified places, and the civilian authorities were thereby released from their responsibility. Finally, in a state of siege, all legal functions of the civilian authorities, insofar as they concern maintaining the internal order and the police force, were passed on to the commander, who exercised them as part of his personal responsibilities. So therefore, the state of siege everything was returned to the commander in that sense. This was not about executive functions. Rather, all the constitutional functions of all the civilian authorities were transferred. The commander had to be given the same legal capacities as any civilian body whose jurisdiction was the preservation of public order and security. This was not a transition of executive power in the modern sense. Okay, notice he's saying this was not a transfer of executive power in the modern sense. On the contrary, it assumed that the chief of the army should exercise all functions by himself. And as in the state of war, appeals to the civilian authority were not mentioned here. Okay. Only in the decree of 1811, which will be discussed later, was the provision made for the army chief should relinquish his function to civilian authority. In consequence, the commander of a fortified place did not step into the jurisdiction like a commissar of the National Convention through appeals or devolutions. He was only entitled to do what a civilian body could have done, albeit exclusively as the law laid down. So in other words, he could do it. In other words, he could only act. He wasn't given the absolute discretion of a commissar. He was only able to do what the law provided, right? Is to do what a civilian body could have done, albeit with the law as the law extends exclusively. In other words, he held it exclusively in that sense. What they could do, but he held that in the state at that moment exclusively. The whole regulation makes sense only if one bears in mind that the state of siege at stake here is an actual situation of severe emergency, which satisfies actual and well circumscribed requirement when the fortified place has been cut off from all external contact. The law, in fact, specifies concrete details. The state of siege is post facto, simply fact, in place. In other words, it's once he's surrounded, you're in siege. The state of siege is it's post facto in place. Okay, that's just stating the statute instead. By contrast, war was declared, and this happened either on the basis of an accession of a legislative body which was requested by the king and which he had to proclaim, or through the king's declaration under the reservation of approved form from the legislative assembly, if the declaration was necessary at the time when the legislative body was not assembled. Article 8, comma 9. The reason for this regulation was that the state of war involved the right of military authorities to make requests of civilian ones. What is more, it permitted the encroachment upon private property, for instance, the demolition without compensation of buildings. Okay. With demolition without compensation of buildings situated within a specified area from the fortification, Article 31 and 32. In urgent cases, when the chief of the army could no longer receive orders from the king, the law generally gave him the authority to implement all measures needed for the defense, and to do so on the basis of a decision coming from the war cabinet, Article 37. The purely factual nature of the entire regulation is completely obvious and requires no further explanation. The word etat, state condition, right, refers to the actual situation, which involves specific consequences permitted by the law, like the state of defense, the l'état de défense of the troops, or the troops stand by, état de réquisition permanente, or state of permanent guard, right? The state of siege is of a fortified place. This is a practical state of a military technical kind. In other words, it's technical. It's a technicality of military technicality. When the army commander declares it, all it amounts to in law is the equivalent to a person acting in self-defense and making his enemy aware that he will make use of his own right to self-defense. The state of siege has not yet become the modal point of a fiction, with which with the help of the state of siege, this concept, has not yet become a nodal point of a fiction with the help of which certain legal consequences are supposed to have come about. So, let's go look at this. Look at this. This is 23. If I'm, yeah, 23. I correct. Yes. Act of 26 May 1792 declared the state of war, not of siege, in a number of areas, with the formula there will be as if they were in a state of war. Further, it declared that the general could represent a fortification to be a place under siege. The king had the authority to add new areas to those named in the Act of 1791 if they were deemed to be in a state of war owing to their location. In Article 3, the general of the army was authorized to declare and to have it proclaimed that such and such positions that they were going to occupy were in a state of war, when he considered that to be necessary either for the security or for the military or for the security or for the military police. The purely technical military treatment of the issue was implicit in the fact that the law had been transferred without any political debate to the committee in charge of military affairs. So this is purely technical, and this is why it didn't really matter in that sense, right? The Jacobins were staunch opponents of martial law, partly because the unleashing of the disorganized masses, through which the Jacobins gained their political powers, could be suppressed with the help of the law. In addition to this general reason, which made any political opposition into an enemy of the institutions that protected the existing order, the martial law made available for the local authorities, which at that time enjoyed a high degree of self-government, according to the Constitution of 1791. The armed forces they could use to serve their federalist interests, suppressing the radical revolutionary movements concentrated in Paris. So again, that's the whole point, that this is the Jacobins didn't like it because it meant that the existing law gave too much authority to the local areas, and therefore they could use it against the interests of the Paris community. He says, it is telling that Blonde, in his capacity as mayor of Millau, organized the battle of the royal communities against the insurgents and was commended for that by the National Assembly. Robespierre opposed the martial law. Louis Blanc reports that only one person protested against this cruel law, Marat, who was of the view that as long as the people were still engaged in the struggle to break their chains, such a law was out of order. Peter Kropotkin, in his book on the French Revolution, talks about this. In the German version, accuses Robespierre of not having opposed martial law in principle. He simply called for a courthouse. He simply called for a courthouse. In other words, he didn't mean there'd be a process, right? Not in principle, but in contrast, Philippe Bondroy, in his observations of Maximilien Robespierre, praises Robespierre because he rejected the brutal martial law. During the food riots, says Fabry Henriot of 30 October 1792, one had to inform and enlighten the proclamation, not impose martial law. So that's there. So let me just do this something. So let's go back to the 24. Yeah. On June 23, 1793, the National Convention abolished the martial law in one sentence. and I think this is just going to be, and it says, the convention national decree declares that martial law is abolished. On 24th July 1793, the Representative of the National Convention, LB, wrote in a report that the predecessor Mirabeau created the martial law at the bosom of free people, that it is now up to us to abolish this disgraceful law which befouls our rights, that the law martial should be cursed, the red flag should be torn apart, and so on. It was assisted by a commissar, by a revolution's legislation, and by the Revolution's Tribunal, which dealt with the enemy according to the rules of judicial process. It retained the state of siege as a purely military institution. A turning point occurred now in the development of this concept by reason of the fact that other areas apart from fortified places could come to be under siege too. And at this first extension was only a technical one, because at the same time the actual state of siege was replaced by a declaration of state of siege, which was intended to justify the legal fiction. So, in other words, that the original thing was the law, that the law said this by certain fortifications and places and outposts. But now what happened, he's saying that this extended to every areas, but before that happened, there had to be a declaration of that act. The distinction is evident in the two laws that were passed before and after the coup d'état by the radical members of the Directorate on 18 Factor, the 4th September 1797. That a military conception became a bedrock of government, corresponded to the militarization of the state. The 13th Vendémiaire, as well as the 18th Victor, were the work of the army. So the state was been militarized in that sense, and he's going to continue here. He goes, the official documentation supporting the fact consists in the law being passed on 18 Fractor. These are the new dates. I don't know there's no equivalent. This is different. They changed the calendar. Remember the revolutionaries. The 5th year, year 5, by which the Directorate was empowered to send troops to the Rayon Constitution, to the Rayon Constitution. Yeah, the constitutional radius. Okay, to the constitutional radius, and the law of 19 Factor, which confirmed that the general of the Home Army had rendered outstanding service to his nation. So again, this is a note expanding that issue. Yep. The law dating from 10 Fractor 5th year, that is August 27th, 1797, extended the applications of the state of war and sieges to communities within the country. The Directorate could declare the state of war, but not the state of siege, once it had been authorized by the legislative body. This meant in practice that the army commander had become a commissarial chief of communities, declared to be at war. In other words, the military commander became the commissarial chief of the communities that declared to be at war, and was no longer answerable to the civilian authorities or submitted to their administration, as under the legislations of martial law. The state of siege maintained a concrete fact. Local communities were under siege as soon as they were cut off by troops or rebels. here the notion of internal enemy cropped up, right? The rebels, right? In this provision. As soon as the coup d'état of 18 Fraktur succeeded, the directorate seized for itself, that is, without the legislative body, the authority of placing a community under the state of siege. In this way, the government could bring about the state of siege whenever it deemed necessary. The formal act of the government's declaration supplanted the real state of emergency. So therefore, in other words, when what happened is that when starting with the coup d'état, right, with the coup d'état of 18 Fraktur, right, the directorate took over the assembly, legislative body, took over. And what happened was that they declared that they could decide who's in state of siege, right? In this way, the government could bring about a state of siege whenever it deemed necessary. The formal act of government declaration supplanted the real state of the emergency, right? So therefore, that this is the change. That before there was what defined a state of siege was the actual emergency. Now, after with the rise of the directorate taking control, right? The directorate taking control, and they're going to decide what is the state of siege or not. The concept gained a political meaning. The technical military procedure was employed in service of domestic politics. Okay, this is where I plan to stop. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, put them down there. We'll see how it goes. Next is, we'll continue. This is the third part of this. If you like the video, like the thing, share it with your friends, share your things. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. It'd be good in that sense. If you didn't like it, I didn't like the video. I didn't like your new locations. Lighting was horrible and things like that. Well, okay, I'm sorry. But if you have any comments or criticisms, you can just do that. You can hit that and say that. Please say it if you have criticisms. Write them down. That way we can learn. And last but not least, okay, the other things is you can follow me on social media. The links are below. My academic social media links are there. If you want to help, contribute to this by becoming a Patreon or subscribe star member or subscriber, like that, you can do so. The links are below. Or if you want to help by buying one of my books, you can do that. So there. We're going to hope we do this. I got this done. So you guys, Monday is going to have a video. I will try to get one every day this week done. So therefore, that's it. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.